Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from whatever time zone you are joining us from. I see we have participants from Australia, Canada, the UK, South Africa. Okay, I think we're gonna get started. I'm gonna hand it over to Abe, and also just a reminder to everyone to try to speak a bit slower for our lovely interpreter, and also for our attendees, always remain respectful in the chat. Over to you, Abe.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. And it's so great to be here with you all again. It does feel like we were just together in Santiago. It's hard to believe it's been, half a year since we gathered there. So this is a really great opportunity for us to continue the learning that started there, well, and also started before that. So it's really great. It's encouraging for me to be part of a global community of knowledge, to have a chance to share expertise. This can be research expertise, lived expertise, service provision expertise with people from across the globe. I really do think that we can solve homelessness. I think it's an issue we have created within our societies, within our structures, within our systems. And the solutions come from the knowledge, all these different types of knowledge, and can be shared with each other. Even though our country situations might feel unique, our policies, our governments, and our services may be different in ways. I think the knowledge that we need and the passion and the work to actually facilitate change is the same globally. So for me, I really appreciated in Santiago how many people joined us from all over the world. I really appreciated calls that were put towards action, as well as really great examples of research excellence in different ways, both qualitative and quantitative excellence that was shared there. So that's most of what I wanted to say. Yeah, I'm Abe. I'm the managing editor of the journal. And so I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you might have. We're at IJOH.ca. And we are a little bit different, perhaps, than some other traditional scientific journals in that, of course, we do publish scholarly research, and that is the majority of our publication. But we also accept what we call discussion articles. And so these may be reflections that you have from lived experience, from service provision, from advocacy. And we accept and review those articles, and we share knowledge of different types. And so if you have questions about if something could be published within our journal, please do reach out to me. I'm happy to chat about your submission. And the other thing that's important to us is that we accept articles in multiple languages, including Spanish, French, Portuguese, Japanese. And so again, if you are interested in submitting an article in your first language, and you're not sure if we can manage that, again, please do reach out to me and just let me know. And what we offer for those authors is that your article will be reviewed entirely within the language of submission. And it's not until we go to publication that we assist you with translating that into English. And so for us, it's really important that scholarship and knowledge is shared in the ways that we're most comfortable, in the languages that we're most familiar with. So that's about IJOH. That's what we are here for, is to learn together. And so really thankful to IJH for facilitating this webinar, for continuing to be a core partner on the journal, and just looking forward to hearing what everyone has to share today. So thanks for being here, and thanks for allowing me to say a few words to open this.
Thank you, Abe. I think this webinar is a great opportunity for anyone who wasn't able to attend the conference in person to hear from some of the lovely practitioners that did contribute to the program. I'm going to hand it over to my lovely colleague Yamitza, who's going to help me introduce our next group of panelists who are from Santiago, Chile, and had a huge hand in helping us to host the conference in January. Over to you, Yamitza.
Thank you, Tiffany. So everyone, my name is Yamitza Yuivar Villarreal. I'm the Vanguard Program Associate at the Institute of Global Homelessness. And I will say this in Spanish. Es un placer hoy día poder presentar a quienes nos acompañan desde Chile. Desde nuestra casa estarán con nosotros dando una presentación Isabel LaCalle Pons, Jorge Quinteros Lizama, William Rosas Olivares, José Guayquil Antil, Mario San Martín, Daniela Quiroga, Jorge Ríos y Carla Orellana. Les agradecemos mucho poder unirse hoy y les dejamos este espacio para su presentación.
Thank you very much to everybody. It's very glad to be again with all of you. We made an abstract what we did in January because then we have 1 hour and a half, and today we just have a few minutes. But with all of our heart, this is a creative and collective initiative about some workers and some lived experience people who live in our housing programs. So enjoy our show.
Señoras, señores, señoritas, señoritos, sean todos bienvenidos a este viaje sensorial. La audioteatro, estilo colectivo, vivencias y poesías de quienes caminan y sienten la calle.
Breves entonces de la calle sentida, sobre la ciudad percibida, con los sentidos.
Disculpa,
Una obra tejida con los retazos de mundo.
se escucha muy bajo. Ya, perdón.
¿No se
escucha muy
escucha?
bajo. No, se escucha muy bajo. ¿Crees que puedas acercar?
Sorry. But when I talk, you could, ¿se escucha cuando yo hablo?
Sí, podemos escucharte a ti, pero creo que el resto está muy lejos del micrófono.
Because I speak very louder.
Ya.
Yeah. Let's try again.
No. A ver, intentando más fuerte. Señoras, señores, señoritas y señoritos, sean todos bienvenidos a este viaje sensorial de la ciudad que percibimos. Un radioteatro construido por las voces, vivencias y poesías de quienes caminan y sienten la calle.
Breves entonces sobre la calle sentida, sobre la ciudad percibida, con los sentidos. Una obra tejida con retazos de muchas voces.
Gente de calle, artistas, soñadores y poetas, todos reunidos en este taller de teatro y poesía realizado en la corporación Nuestra Casa.
Está dedicado a la memoria de nuestro amigo Shannen.
Por quienes ya no están, para recordar a quienes ya se fueron, recibir a quienes amablemente vinieron y a los que están por venir, que ojalá sean cada vez menos, porque lo que más deseamos es que no viva gente en la calle.
Estamos próximos a cumplir 25 años como sistema de la ciudadanía activa, como organización de la sociedad civil en el próximo mes de agosto.
Hoy celebramos el arte como forma de amor y a la ciudad como escuchando las contradicciones, bella y cruel, dura y tierna, llena de amores, sonidos, sabores y también dolores.
La vemos gris en la mañana, color neón por la noche, rostros apresurados, miradas esquivas, casas que esperan y casas que pasan.
La olemos a flores y a smog, a comida casera y a peligro, a benzina, a miedo y también a esperanza.
La escuchamos, risas, alarmas, música, llanto, una ciudad ruidosa que a veces grita y a veces susurra.
La tocamos con el cuerpo y la sentimos en el alma.
Pero todo no es físico. También sentimos el humor, la pertenencia, la belleza, la vida misma. Y cuando todo eso se une, nace el sentipensamiento, pensar sintiendo, sentir pensando.
La ciudad que percibimos con los sentidos que son más de 5.
Sí, porque toca sumarles a esto, a los 5 sentidos, uno más, el sentido de sí mismo. Capacidad extraordinaria para sentirse, pensarse, considerarse y amar uno más y mejor.
También el sentido estético, que tiene que ver con nuestro vínculo con la naturaleza, con el goce por la belleza, con el agrado de las cosas buenas de la vida y con la alegría de la libertad.
El sentido del humor, por la agudeza del sentipensamiento y la risa a flor de labios, a flor de piel, como la pelusa del durazno.
El sentido de pertenencia, valor que nos encuentra y nos hace sentir vinculados a un grupo, a una comunidad, a un pueblo, a una ciudad. Un sentimiento de aceptación, de identidad contigo, conmigo y también contigo, hermano.
Queremos una ciudad con concordia, con ternura, con juego, donde cada uno ponga algo bueno, como un brócoli. Sí, como un fractal, una ciudad construida desde adentro.
Esa palabra nos gusta en nuestro taller de teatro y poesía, concordia.
Concordia es porque viene del corazón. En latín, cordis es corazón. Del latín cordis, corazón, esfuerzo, ánimo. De dónde provienen también la palabra cordial y la palabra cordura.
Concordia es estar con el corazón.
Así nos parece que podríamos andar mejor en la ciudad. Así nos parece que podríamos percibir mejor en las ciudades. Es en concordia, con suavidad y ternura, con amor y respeto.
El voluntariado es algo que me gusta mucho hacer. Puedo dar aliento, transmitir que sí podemos cambiar y ser otros, ser mejores, avanzar. La vida me ha cambiado mucho, dejé vicios, me controlo, he logrado poder ver a mi hija, poquito, pero para mí es un logro, me mantengo para lograrlo. Y ha sido fundamental el apoyo de la corporación Nuestra Casa y todo el equipo que trabaja ahí.
Este radioteatro es un homenaje a quienes ya no están, a los que llegaron y a los que luchan por vivir más, por no vivir más en la calle.
La ciudad no está rota, y nosotros tampoco. Aquí estamos, completos, con corazón, con cabeza, con historia y con arte.
Entre corazón y razón, sentipensamos mejor.
La poesía y el teatro no solo entretienen, reparan, conectan y liberan.
Desde el barrio Yungay, donde de esta nuestra casa, eso fue la ciudad que percibimos. Nos despedimos con palabras sabias.
Somos lo que hacemos día a día. La excelencia no es un acto, sino un hábito.
Sabemos lo que somos, pero no lo que podríamos ser.
Hasta la próxima, y que el viento se lleve lo dicho, pero no lo olvidado, y ni lo perdón.
Now we want to share a song that also wrote this group as a collective, and we will put it in the chat so everybody could sing with us or read it or just have it. Please, William.
Si quieres cambiar el modo, todo de vivir así. Si quieres aportar al mundo, vida útil en soledad feliz. Mata de uno mismo, amigos, viviremos la verdad. Nuestra unión es solidaria de justicia, amor y paz. Nuestra unión es solidaria de justicia, amor y paz. Humildad es piedra angular y reconocerme la verdad. Somos imponentes ante la droga y el alcohol, otra vez y honestidad. Nuestra vida sería oportuna y insoportables a que más dar. Vamos a nuestra casa, hermanos, a vivir la vida con dignidad. Vamos a nuestra casa, hermanos, a vivir una vida con dignidad. Referencia al bienestar común. Dios, la autoridad fundamental. No devuelve el sano juicio y ponemos nuestra voluntad. Admitimos ante Dios y una dimensión perfecta moral que nos libra de nuestros defectos y reparamos nuestro mal. Nos libera de nuestros defectos y reparamos nuestro mal. El amor, la comprensión, nuestro código de razón, tolerancia y el respeto complementan nuestra misión. Dando un resultado, hermano, un despertar espiritual. Llevaremos el mensaje que también en la calle está. Llevaremos este mensaje a los que ya sufriendo están. Nuestra casa nos acogió. Los equipos de trabajo nos acogió. Nuestra casa nos acogió. La vocación. Nuestra casa nos acogió. Sacar gente de la calle, nuestra misión no. Y para mí somos campeón. Para mí todo cambió.
Thank you very much. And we just want to say feliz cumpleaños, happy birthday to Jorge.
Happy birthday.
Feliz cumpleaños. Muchas gracias por toda esta presentación.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for that song. We are delighted to hear from people with lived expertise. We think that you all's expertise and your experience should be centered in all of this work. So thank you very much for that lovely presentation. Yes, so we will move on to our next panelist, Alana Jones, who is founder of Border Place Inc. and instructor at the University of Toronto, and Khater, who is PhD student in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Western University in Canada. Over to you all.
Thank you so much for having us. Khater, are you going to share the screen? Welcome, everyone.
Sure. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, we can.
So we had a better plan, but we used, apparently me and Alana, we used different laptops, so our slides gotta change. So sorry, a lot of like cool graphs that we created won't be available. Go ahead, Alana, over to you.
You can change the slide. So our presentation is going to be focused on how we move our evidence into action. I just want to acknowledge again that we, both Khater and I, collected our data on the land of the First Nations, and we want to acknowledge all Indigenous peoples across Canada. One of the things that we talked about, Khater and I, is that when we presented in Chile, specifically around the prevalence of Black homelessness, we talked about, so how do we move from the data that we collected and how do we put our evidence into action? Specifically, I would be talking about community care management and system navigation for private rooming house operators within the Toronto region. And Khater will be speaking around housing and health among asylum seekers, and we'll connect that later on in the presentation. So we needed to listen to the evidence, and it was clear to us that we needed to ensure that now that we had some robust data around who was homeless, who we were seeing, folks who had addiction and mental health, we had a lot of individuals who were involved in the justice system, as well as individuals who were asylum seekers, newcomers to Ontario, or folks who had experienced chronic homelessness and episodic homelessness. And what were we doing in terms of the data that we had received? Like we knew that there was a lot of inequities in terms of how people navigated homelessness. But one of the key factors we recognize is that our private landlords had a significant role to play in the work that we were doing, and they were often kept out of that equation as a partner. Oftentimes we hear about the term slumlord, but not every private operator is a slumlord. And so we wanted to recognize that. And so we started thinking about what was our partnership accountability, right? We wanted to ensure that landlords were guided in supporting individuals who were vulnerable, and they also had the adequate training and supports needed to support such a population. And in doing so, we recognized that homeless individuals placed in rooming houses actually found homes. So it wasn't just a shelter, it wasn't just a placeholder for them. People were starting to stabilize. Then we started looking at, well, how do we identify the gaps once people are placed? And we knew that private operators, based on our research, is that they needed to be high quality service. We wanted to ensure that they had guidance. So regardless of if they were funded or not funded, we wanted to ensure that they had some guiding principles, that they had policies in place, that they had the ability to tap into some of the resources that organizations that were funded had the ability to do so. So for example, did they get training in terms of first aid and CPR? Were they well versed or at least knew how to system navigate in terms of connecting people to harm reduction supports and services? Right? Were they even trained in terms of the Narcan process, right? What was their response? And we knew that response couldn't just be calling 911. Were they equipped to do de-escalation? So again, just looking at them being a partner and also ensuring that they had the tools so that they can be part of the equation in terms of ending homelessness. And that was a big gap that we had seen. And of course, one of the things we also recognized here too was around language, the use of language, right? So instead of, I remember someone talking about, well, who is a sex worker, right? And understanding that. Should I say substance user opposed to drug user? So again, just those little nuances we saw that really helped our private landlords to feel empowered in providing services, but it also supported individuals feeling a sense of home opposed to, you know, I'm just at this rooming house and I'm not being adequately supported. We knew that we needed to have integrated care, right? And understanding that if we didn't have a community care management plan, then vulnerable individuals will kind of slip between the cracks. So supporting landlords in creating a plan, a co-create plan, like what are your goals? What are you intending to do? Who are you going to call if there's a crisis, right? So supporting landlords to create crisis plans. And we know for a fact that private landlords coming into this work either inherited their buildings. We knew that they took it on as an investment property, so they didn't have those linkages to communities in the same way as someone who was kind of intentionally coming into the homeless services work. And so part of that was helping landlords to create a list of who are your community programming? What are the life skills stuff that you can do internally? What are the places that you could connect folks to externally? And so again, creating that sense of safety and security and recognizing that without these integrated services, individuals cannot be successful. But if we bring some of those services within private landlords, again, we can see folks stabilizing a little bit sooner. Finally, private landlords are not connected to that big data collection set. And so we knew for a fact that 72% of the individuals who had come into our program, this was the first time they'd had experienced housing stability. What we didn't know prior to that was how long had they been homeless? What are some of the places that they had gone through? And so that data, we thought, it's going to support us in reducing chronic homelessness, because certainly we knew that a number of the individuals, this was the first time that they had experienced any kind of housing stability. And so we thought we need to get landlords, private landlords, equipped to collect robust data so that we can prevent episodic homelessness and chronic homelessness. And that's a data set that we continue to miss. And so in partnering and working with Khater, I started talking about, but we noticed that more people were reporting housing stability. And we were, well, why is that? Well, because we took the approach of this kind of integrated model, we connected people to health services, we connected people to some of these other services, and then we realized that there was a connection between our health and our housing. And so that's where the work continued with Khater.
Thank you, Alana. So yeah, as the collaborative work that we started is part of my thesis work and working with my supervisor, Dr. Rebecca Sheff and Michelle Bedard. We looked into the housing and health of asylum seekers and refugees in Canada. And why is that? We see asylum seekers and refugees present growing number globally. And just in 2024, there were over 50 million individuals worldwide who fall into this category. And why such high number? The primary drivers of these numbers are armed conflicts and political instability and persecution and climate change as well, and other natural disasters that we see. So what people often do is are often forced to flee from their home in search of safety and protection. But what challenges do they face? Unfortunately, after they arrive in places like Canada, um, they continue to face, even though Canada is one of the countries that, known for welcoming refugees and asylum seekers. And in just 2019, they received over 30,000 asylum seekers and refugees, and predominantly obviously from regions with a conflict. However, once asylum seekers they arrive, they face a lot of barriers, that's including shelter, access to service, and limited access to, for example, chronic condition screening or like mental health. And we know that a lot of individuals who are fleeing violence, they often experience trauma along the way or the home country, so they have less access to healthcare. So, and we know that all of this exacerbate the already existing condition was housing being like accessible to them. So we wanted to see like what are the association between housing and health of asylum seekers and refugees. So our objective for the research was to look into what are the association between living in social housing or shelter and the health outcome and physical and health and mental health of asylum seekers and refugees. So, and in addition, we explored the factors that contribute to that, such as chronic conditions, homelessness, and current housing conditions. So the quality of the housing, or if it was that social housing. So we conducted a cross-sectional study across Canada, and our target population were asylum seekers and refugees who were living in social housing, and also who were over 18 years old and spoke English, Arabic, or French. And the reason we choose this category of language is because of this, or the most spoken language according to the IRCC Immigration Refugee Citizenship of Canada. And for the data collection, we used World Health Organization Quality of Life Brief survey. and we distribute it through working with like collaborative organizations such as like shelters organization, the Borden place that I just Alana mentioned. So what we found, so we found that homelessness was a common experience among participants in our study. And as we see, more than half of the participants reported experiencing homelessness at some point in their life. So when we break down that by immigration status, we look at two groups, asylum seekers and refugees. So the rate of asylum homelessness were similar almost. Among asylum seekers, was almost 60% had experienced homelessness. So that's a big number. And among refugees, this number was slightly higher at 60.5%. And so the type of the house where our participant resided. So we had, when we look at housing type, most of the participants were living in shelters, while 39.9, almost 40%, I should say, in social housing. And when we break down again into like immigration status among asylum seekers, we see in the higher number of asylum seekers tend to live in shelters compared to refugees where was like mostly likely to live in social housing. And another interesting measure that we kind of like the World Health Organization quality of life survey is like a standard, but we incorporate also survey for chronic conditions. And these are self-reported chronic conditions, and we found that high prevalence of chronic conditions on participants. So over 60% of participants reported experiencing mental health challenges, specifically depression or anxiety, and this shows the significant mental health burden that within this population. So other notable mental health issues we found also, including conditions such as hypertension and diabetes. So we wanted to see like further dive deep into this, and so we further grouped this to better understand the burden of chronic. So we grouped participants based on the number of conditions that they reported. So to see like we see more than 27% had no condition, and then more than half of the participants reported one or two chronic condition, and 18% more than 3 conditions. So one of the key findings, so from our regression analysis, for the sake of the time, I'll just be quick here. We run regression models to explore how housing conditions and health outcome are linked among asylum seekers and refugees. So first, we found that poor housing condition, like overcrowding, safety concerns, or lack of privacy were significantly associated with lower physical health, such as psychological health, social relationship, and environmental health. And as well, participants, people who experienced homelessness, reported significantly lower physical health and social relationships. And also, individuals who reported a greater number of chronic conditions. So the more chronic condition have, they were also associated with poor physical health. And individual who lived in social shelters compared to social housing was reported like lower or worse physical and psychological health. So for conclusion, so as we see that poor housing condition is significantly associated with negative health outcome in asylum seekers and refugees, and homelessness and chronic conditions further worsen their housing stability. So how to address this? Targeted could focus on homelessness prevention, providing stability and a stable housing solution to ensure like long-term security, and also improved health access to healthcare services, to particularly for managing like chronic conditions that we've seen. So, and these are the reference that's for me, and I think we're a little bit over time. So yeah, that's for us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. You all touched on so many important points, intersectionality and just the global scale of homelessness, and we'll share the resources from them following the webinar, so you all can really dive into their presentation. We will have Harry go next. So Harry is joining us from Singapore. He is a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at National University of Singapore. Harry, over to you.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. Just let me share this. Okay, I do have notes with me, so if I look down, I'm just reading my notes.
No, that's perfectly fine.
That's fine, yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My presentation today, what I presented in Santiago was basically to look at transitions across different life stages of long-term homeless people in Singapore. Well, the findings itself was drawn from a 3-year qualitative study on long-term homelessness. The methods that we use were typically in-depth interviews, participant observations, and some ethnographic methods, such as collecting field notes. So basically, our participants were recruited recruited from various social service agencies, recruited from certain community organizations working with homeless people in Singapore. And we started with 50 participants, and by the time we ended the studies, we had an attrition of 9. So, this is the wrong one. Okay. Okay, so to the theoretical approach that we use for this study, we basically use a life course approach. So essentially, we look at, if you look at the chart here, we basically had 4 life stages. We looked at 4 different life stages: childhood, adulthood, older adulthood, and old age. What we really did here also was we created life biography pathways. Very similar to what Megan Ravenhill did in her PhD work in that book called The Culture of Homelessness. And also, when we created this life bio pathways, we were basically looking for life events that are associated with long-term homelessness from our participants. And we were interested in how the life events of our participants actually compare with the normative life trajectories of other people in Singapore. For instance, at what age do people usually leave school? At what age do they get married? And what kind of deviations are there? And then we looked at, we analyzed this in terms of the impact on their housing outcomes. And of course, what we came up with at the end of this entire study was that we looked at, we thought, one way to really conceptualize this research was to look at key life transitions for these long-term homeless people. And of course, that's from McNaughton's work as well. So that's about it. We have 4 life stages, and these are the 4 life stages I'm going to go through today. And I'm going to look at how they impact certain housing outcomes like affordability, occupancy, and eligibility. All right. Yeah, this slide is just gives us an overview of the findings in the study. So what you can see here is basically from left to right, we do see on the left are, okay, let me just rephrase this. So on the left are childhood trajectories. So as a person moves from the left to right, it's the entire life course. So we end then on the right-hand side with old age and so on. So we see certain kind of trajectories that are typical among our participants in childhood, such as transitions from education to work, family instability, and so on. And then as you go through adulthood, you start to see that people do go through transitions through debt and bankruptcy, and so on and so forth. I'm going to just talk about this later on as well. So, yeah, without further ado, I will just go and take us through some of these transitions that we have identified. So the first one here will be the transitions through from education to work. There are a few points that I want to make here. Number one, what we see from our participants are high dropout rates at primary school or primary and secondary levels. So when they leave school, what happens with some of these participants, they go into informal casual work. For example, I have one of the participants mentioned that he left school very early to join his father in to do gardening for people living in private houses and so on. What's the impact of this transition or this premature transition from education to work. Well, the key impact is at the last point here, basically that premature transitions actually limit opportunities for upward mobility and financial resilience in adulthood. And it leads to a trajectory of low wage employment and limited long-term wage goals. So let's move on to the next one. So another transition in childhood was basically transition through family instability. What we found was that family instability experiences were mainly parental related. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side here, parental related cases are either the parents were divorced or separated, or where there's an absence of parent supervision or the loss of biological parents. And we also have victims of abuse. So these are all factors that created family instability experiences and how people transited in childhood through all these experiences. Now, what's the impact? Well, the impact for them is really this, right? So family instability leads to adverse outcomes, such as dropping out from school, at-risk behaviors, typically either they tell us that they joined a gang when they're very young, or they tell us that they did drugs when they're very young. And some of the participants also talk about early marriages as a result of, family instability. They got married quite young, like 18 years old. And of course, one of the adverse outcome of this was childhood homelessness as well. So the key point here is that impact of family instability actually extend beyond childhood. It's not just a childhood transition, but extend all the way into adulthood and older adulthood. Typically in terms of the social emotional development. So I have one participant who actually, here I'm going to look at my notes for his quotation. I think he was actually saying this to us. He said that, the fact that I do not have, the fact that I gone through family instability, my parents were not there. It meant that they weren't there. They were not there to teach me anything. I mean, what he really meant was social emotional kind of stuff, like making friends. So by the time he was in his adulthood, he actually asked himself, why is it so difficult for me to maintain friendships? And then he said that I realized there are things that, people know how to do that I don't. And yeah, to maintain friendships, and for him, he just found that it's very hard to connect with people. So some of these things so that's basically what he was trying to tell us. And the last point on this slide is trying to show that as well. And then there's also this transition in childhood transition through youth delinquency. What we do find here is that there are really two types of behaviors that when we talk about youth delinquency, we're basically talking about two things, right? Substance use and gang involvement. So it is associated with early school dropouts. It's also associated with family instability. And so by now, what you then get a sense of is that actually most of these transitions are interrelated, right? They don't just happen in silo. They're connected to one another. And the point that we really wanted to make here was that when participants go through this lifetime struggle with addiction, with stigma, the last point here, incarceration and institutional living, actually this lifetime struggle do not start when they are old. It starts when they're pretty young, right? Most participants in this group actually were incarcerated before the age of 20. So I'm going to move on to this slide on transitions through homelessness in childhood. And basically what we are trying to show here is that actually we tend to, sometimes when we look at homelessness, we tend to look at it as, okay, there's homelessness and then there's the rest of the issues that people do go through, or rest of the stresses that people do go through. But actually homelessness is also a key life transitions that I think that we should consider as well. So that's why we put it as a key transition for people in childhood as well. So childhood homelessness, from our participants, basically are characterized by housing occupancies issues, right? Moving in, by now the literature is pretty clear on this, how young people move in and out of family homes, and basically couch surf with their friends, boyfriend, girlfriends, and so on. So for our participants, there's just some figures there if you're interested in it. Like the first experience of homelessness for some of this group of participants that experienced child homelessness was 15 years old. And well, let me just take a look at some, yep. The other point that I really want to stress on for this slide here is that the exits, though possible during childhood, were often precarious due to unresolved family issues and ongoing stresses, which means then that people do fall into homelessness again, even though they have exited homelessness in childhood. So if you look at this guy here, this example that I showed here is basically from, I think, if I'm not wrong, is from a 62-year-old long-term homeless male. So what you do see here is that alongside with how he, became homeless, you see all the different kind of transitions that we were identifying in this study here. So this transition from education to work started at age 12, and then you have the transition to youth delinquency, and then by the time he reached like after 16 years old, he went through homelessness. And yeah, so this is how a child, what we essentially tried to do and analyze in our transitions here. Let me then move on to, I think, adulthood and older adulthood. Well, adulthood and older adulthood, I think the first transition that we can't identify is the transition through marital union and separation. Someone asked me the question, why do we even have transition through marital unions? I mean, shouldn't we just focus on separation and divorce, right? So I think the answer to that is that for our participants, or at least in the case of Singapore, I think this transition happens over and over again. And it's not just a one-time thing for some of the participants that we are talking about. Right? Such transitions through marriage, through separation, through divorce can happen and can occur multiple times. And each time it occurs, it takes away the resources. It takes away the housing resources. It takes away the financial resources. People go through expensive divorce and so on. And yeah, so that's why we talk about this transition this way. So if you look there at the slide there, we have for male participants some of the potential contributors to separation, and then we kind of differentiate it with female participants. I think what we really want to emphasize here is this, that I think our female participants, they were more likely to be vulnerable to financial insecurity post-divorce, because they tend to enter into marriage quite young, as compared to the males in our study. And so women then, or at least the female participants in our studies, typically have a shorter runway to build their own personal financial assets, especially if they transit out the labor market to become a full-time homemaker. So by the time they face housing crisis, that's where they find that, financial insecurity set in for them. Okay, so next slide. Another transition for adulthood and older adulthood for our participants is this transitions through long-term work inactivity and irregular income. This is quite a significant transition because more than half of our participants actually experience long-term work inactivity and irregular income in adulthood and older adulthood. What does long-term work inactivity refers to? It actually refers to not being in any form of employment for more than a year, and that's the definition that we gave for this one. Some of the reasons why people actually could not work for, were not working for the long term or had irregular income, is basically in this box over here. I'm not going to go through them. Well, the point to note here is that most participants could actually return to some employment in their adulthood and older adulthood. But long periods of not working and not having regular income, even when they return back to the workforce, had a direct impact on participants' financial resources. And of course, a direct impact on their resilience to any housing insecurity. So that's the point that I want to make for this slide. We also identified transitions through debt and bankruptcy. Some participants actually reported experiencing debt and bankruptcy in their adulthood and older adulthood. So again, the causes of debt on the right-hand side, basically mortgage, health care issues, healthcare related costs, right? Some people do not have insurance, and sometimes the healthcare, they tell us that, they went into debt because, of sudden health crisis, and business failures and investment loss as well. I think that and bankruptcy actually highlights a complex relationship between financial instability and homelessness. Why do I say that? Because financial challenges like debt and bankruptcy is a direct source of housing insecurity. It's a direct source or contributed directly to participants' trajectory into homelessness. But they also had a major impact on family stability. So here we see then, not just again, the interrelatedness of all these different transitions coming into play. And that's why the last point here tells us, we made a last point here, is actually regaining financial footing becomes very difficult because of all these different interrelated issues that are happening in people's life, right? Not only do you have debt, you have a housing insecurity, you have family instability, some people are going through divorce and so on. So it all comes together. Next. And then we identified, the fourth one we identified was transitions through multiple incarceration. So some of our participants were incarcerated, multiple times, from 2 to 11 times in their adulthood and older adulthood. Why so many times? Because two reasons. There's a continuation of so earlier on when I talk about childhood, we talk about this transition through youth delinquency. It's basically a continuation of the criminal behavior from childhood. And some of this behavior that continue, gang-related activities, if you start young, you typically continue until you're older. And the second cause is basically the addictive nature of certain criminal behavior. So in Singapore, and I'm sure in many other countries, the consumption of drugs is one such activity that is addictive, and it just continues. People relapse, people go into this over and over again. So what is the common issues with this transitions through multiple incarceration? What we really found is that if you are incarcerated multiple times, there will be poor outcomes in key domains of adulthood transition, such as higher education, sustained employment, family stability, and independent living. Also, participants report that, this is quite clear in the literature as well, that people who go through this kind of transitions literally grow old on the institutional circuit. And by the time they come out of this circuit, they find themselves ill prepared, for normal daily life. Okay. Now transitions through homelessness in adulthood and older adulthood. I think I'm just going to make a quick point here because of time. Maybe I'll make 2 points. Most participants actually encountered homelessness for the first time in adulthood and older adulthood. So this is the typical, in Singapore at least, this is the common trajectory into long-term homelessness, as in their long-term homelessness actually begin in adulthood and older adulthood and not in childhood. So, and what we really want to say here is that for adulthood, the impact of key life transitions on housing is increasingly crucial and more pronounced than childhood. And that's because by the time you reach adulthood, the expectations is for you to, get your own housing, for you to buy your own homes, for you to or rent in the open market. So if you are unable to do it during adulthood and older adulthood, you find that, some of this homelessness itself actually impacts on this a fair deal. Let me just look at this chart here. Okay, so for example, maybe I'll just go through this. If you look at this chart, this person's life here is basically a 52-year-old female. What you do see is that despite being financially stable and independent at the start of adulthood, she actually transited through debt and bankruptcy at age 40 and then separation and divorce at age 48. So even by the time we at the last point of contact, what she was actually going through here is she was still trying to appeal to get into long-term housing. So this case actually shows us that people might start off financially stable, but as they go through adulthood transitions, this really depletes kind of their resources as well. And then finally, with old age, actually we did not identify any other new transitions in old age from our participants. This is because I think transitions in old age, there was not, by the time people reached their old age, there was no drastic, there's not really any drastic departure from the kind of trajectories that they have already established in their adulthood and older adulthood. So basically what we wanted to show then is just a slide on transitions through homelessness in old age. I think a few things that I can say about this slide here is that many of the homelessness in old age can be traced back to earlier periods in participants' life where they encountered kind of significant challenges in such as unstable employment, substance addiction, health issues, and fractured social relationships. In other words, homelessness in old age is basically a result of the transitions that have already happened in childhood, already happened in adulthood and older adulthood. And that's, I think, the key point that I want to make here. Also, I think if you look at, maybe just to go through this one a little bit, if you look at this example here of a 69-year-old male, by the time he reached his older adulthood, he has actually gotten into long-term housing. So I started this in older adulthood. Maybe just to be clear as well, sorry. So older adulthood, we kind of cut it off at age 64 and age 65 and above are the old age category. So if you look at older adulthood, he has gotten into long-term housing. But what happens here is that even though he's in long-term housing, he actually suffered relapses in terms of his alcohol addiction. And it repeated admissions into hospital, into halfway house. And what this shows us here is actually the idea that, despite being housed, some people do not find stability. And while, a participant like this guy actually have gained access to long-term housing, the challenge of occupying that house or staying house remains a very salient one. So the question then for us is, how do we then keep people housed? What kind of community do we create for people? So with that, let me just go on to my last slide. So what's the whole implications for prevention here? I think the key implications that we are looking at here is early intervention. I think when we look at this life course approach that we applied to study long-term homelessness, it actually shows us that the challenges of long-term homelessness actually begins at the earlier life stages, at all the earlier transitions that we have mentioned. And so this that's the first point. The second point is that this early adversities, this early transitions actually persist all the way into older adulthood, into old age as well. And the findings therefore suggest a very clear point for prevention, that if we want to prevent homelessness, we don't start at old age, we don't start at older adulthood, we start early. We start early when people are in their childhood, where people are in their teens, where people are in their early adulthood, and so on. So that's, I think, the key point that we are trying to make here. And there are a few more things that I think, 2 more points here. And then where should we basically do the early intervention? I think one of the key suggestions that we are trying to say here is that I think risk assessment is very important. And it should involve agencies that work with people who experience stresses in life, for example, in schools, in social service agencies, even in places like prisons. And the last point that I think I want to leave you with is actually this. The assessment tool is also very important. Oftentimes we use assessment tools or different agencies use different assessment tools, and then you don't have a kind of synergy between the different assessment tools. So I think the key here is to co-create and to standardize these assessment tools. Otherwise, the assessment won't be effective and it won't be sustainable. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. That was such a great presentation. Love your points about coordinated efforts throughout the duration of a person's entire life. I think that's very important. Thank you, Harry.
You're welcome.
Hi, Tiffany. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Remembrance is the manager of the Street Homelessness Unit in Pretoria, University of Pretoria in South Africa. Over to you, Remembrance.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I want to apologize. I won't be able to project my presentation currently, but I hope I'll be audible. So basically, I'm going to share with you guys on the exercise that we undertook from the University of Pretoria, the Unit for Street Homelessness, the first ever count that the city of Tshwane we did. So as I've been introduced, my name is Remembrance Mokwena, and I am based at the University of Pretoria at the Unit for Street Homelessness, which is hosted by the Center for Faith and Community under the Faculty of Theology. So in 2022, we undertook the first homeless count in the city of Tshwane, and we named the exercise Everyone Counted Counts. And I will share with you when I speak about we, who are we, it's not just the unit, we have partners that I will share with everyone as I continue in this presentation. So firstly, let me just explain why the count and why the survey, because we did not just do the statistic count, we also accompanied that with a survey. And we believe that we had to undertook or we had to do this because every homeless person counts. And we also wanted to be able to have more accurate figures when it comes to the homeless population in order to be able to inform strategies, strategic intervention, in order to be able to inform budgetary decisions and service distribution within the city of Tshwane. We also believed that this exercise will assist in establishing a more robust methodological for enumerating homeless population. And as I've indicated, who is we who undertook this first homeless count in the city of Tshwane in 2022? This was a partnership between the Unit for Street Homelessness, as I have explained, and also the Tshwane Homelessness Forum. This is a forum that represents a NPO or non-government, non-profit organizations within the Tshwane region. And also we also partnered with UNISA, the University of South Africa. we also partnered with the city of Tshwane, our metropolitan municipality. We were also getting ad hoc endorsement and advice from Bloomberg, and of course, our partners, the IJOH, the Institute for Global Homelessness. And also the count was supported by 395 volunteers. Just to continue, before we get deeper, we had a specific focus in terms of who is the homeless population that we are going to count. So we adopted the definition that says people who live on the streets, on the pavement, under the bridges, in the bushes near or next to rivers, in open areas, who fall outside a viable social network or any kind of assistance. And therefore, they are not able to provide themselves with any form of shelter at a given time or any form of a place at a given time. And this definition, we extracted it from the Tshwane homeless policy. We also included people who are living in shelters, believing that they ended up in shelters due to homelessness. And we included the bed buildings, the abandoned buildings in the city of Tshwane. Apart from the definition that we had adopted, we also had some overarching considerations. So basically what we believed in, or some of the considerations is, as you will know that we are part of the IJOH, the Vanguard cities, and our aim is to end homelessness in particular population, and at the moment we are particularly focusing on ending older persons' homelessness. So we also had that in consideration. We also adopted what Rosemary Hagari has defined to say, if you want to end homelessness, you need to be able to identify it earlier, and you need to be able to make it brief and act at an earlier stage in order to be able to mitigate against the homelessness growing. So those were some of the overarching considerations that we did. I will just share briefly the methodology, but I will not go into deep. So basically, things that we considered, each of these had a champion. So we had a champion who had to look at project and process conceptualization and management. We had a champion who was looking at partnership and development. We had a champion who was looking at mapping during, pre, during, and post the count. We also had champion who was championing volunteer recruitment, management, and training. We also had a championing media and communication strategy, and a champion for logistics management, a champion for safety protocol and management, a champion for data gathering management and analysis, and of course, a champion for dissemination of findings and reporting and project closure. So each of these had a champion who now will unpack each step in a detail, but because of time, I will not unpack each of everyone. What we did, we had a pilot count, and then we did a full count, and then special count. And I think what you might be interested in is actually the outcome. So basically, we were able to count and survey 4,177, which of course, some of you might have seen from our statistic South Africa census that the number differs, and we are currently in a process preparing for the second count in Tshwane for 2025, and we are working very closely with the statistic South Africa so that we can be able to also weigh in the difference in terms of the outcome that they came, the conclusion that they came to, and what we came to. So it's very exciting that we are now working very closely with them. They are part of the methodology design and the whole process. And at the end of the day, we had, I think I did mention the number of volunteers that we have. So we mapped the whole area of Tshwane. We did a count within the 7 regions of Tshwane. Tshwane has got 7 regions. And what we did, we identified the spots, the hot spots where the homeless individuals are. We identified the shelters, the bed buildings, and we worked with the Department of Geography in the University of Pretoria to now do an interactive map for all these areas. And I wanted to share with you the outcome in terms of the breakdowns, but I think in respect of time, I will not get into that, but let me touch on one thing, the issue of the budget. We were able to do the count at a budget of 138,000, which currently when we are planning, like I said, the 2025, we are sitting at a budget of around 350,000 because we have seen that we did manage to do a successful count in 2022 at a lower budget. However, for us to improve in some of the areas, we needed to also see that there is an investment in terms of that budget. Now, what we are interested in, like I said, it was not just doing the count for the sake of getting numbers. It was doing the count so that we can transform that count, the data into action. So at the end of the day, we were able to come up with a set of recommendations. And our recommendations were actually pertaining to two particular areas. The first, it was the actual count, the methodology, and the second, it was influencing strategic intervention. And we a certain number of recommendations that we came conclusion to. So I think maybe I can just quickly read a few of that just so that you can have, but we can share this in detail. So one of the things was, in order to have a successful count, we need to institutionalize the count. We had agreed after doing the 2022 count that we will do our count on every second year. However, due to some things, we were not able to do it last year. Hence, we are doing it now in 2025, which is the third year. We also recommended that for a successful count, we need to have a dedicated budget from our local and our provincial government. We are engaging very much again with them. They are part of the plenary sessions. They are part of the conversations in terms of ensuring that we could secure a budget so that we can be able to run a more effective count. Like I said, formalizing the relationship with Statistics South Africa, that was one of the recommendations. And I want to say we are glad that at this particular point, with the current count, we have a very good relationship with Statistics South Africa. They are involved in throughout the process. So that recommendation has been realized. The appointment of a project coordinator, of course, that speaks to a budget. So at the moment, the unit is still the main facilitator, the main coordinator. However, we believe that for the count to be successful, we need to be able to have a project coordinator who will not just wait for the time of the count, but can engage with the processes throughout. And we need to have the right regional champions. Like I've mentioned in our methodology, each area had a champion. So we have realized that we need to improve and ensure that each champion is well placed, is the right to champion that particular activity, and also using maps more deliberately. So we are still again in the 2025 count working with the Department of Geography, continue to improve on the maps that we have designed or that they have been populated in 2022. And we are working with the stakeholders and the NPOs to be able to read and deliberately and intentionally use these maps more successfully. And I think the last one I would say is to be able to engage with new research questions. We're able to find from that count that we only have a few number of older persons homelessness. Hence, this is something that we can be able to address specifically, and hence we have launched an older persons manifesto in April that is working towards ending older persons homelessness. We're also engaging with the issue around LGBTQI, that space in homelessness. So we are engaging with new questions that we were able to identify when we did the 2022 count. I think for the sake of time, I will just And thank everyone for giving me the opportunity. It was not easy. My gadgets are failing me today, but we can share the presentation, and also we have the book that documents that. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, team.
Thank you so much, Remembrance. That was a lovely presentation, and we are very grateful for you trying again and again to actually present in real time. So thank you so much. You touched on so many important things, especially the need for standardized data and strengthening partnerships between practitioners. So thank you again, and we'll share the information in detail following the webinar. And last but not least, we have Shannen Vallesi. She is a researcher at the Institute of Health Research at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and founding member of Home2Health research team. Over to you, Shannen. And for all the attendees, we apologize for going over time, but if you're able to stay, please do. We're very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So my presentation this evening for me here in Perth, Western Australia is a bit different from what I actually presented at the conference. So I'll be talking a little bit about what my team, the Home2Health research team, does a bit more broadly. I'll keep it very high level. I'm very conscious that we're meant to finish in 3 minutes. So we are a mixed methods research team, really focused on undertaking research that is valuable on the ground to frontline service providers and for people that are actually experiencing homelessness. Some of what I will go through tonight is a bit of an amalgamation of our research that we've done over the last decade working in this space. So very broadly, this is hopefully a understandable diagram that I've put together for you, but I think it encapsulates this idea that kind of working in the center here, we're working in the space of primarily homelessness and health, but there is a lot of other groups experiencing vulnerabilities that are included within this, with the overarching kind of goal of reducing health inequities, whether that is worse health outcomes, poor access to care, whether that's via eligibility and exclusion criteria or other financial and logistical barriers that might be presented to people to be able to access healthcare and be able to follow up and continue that healthcare on the long term. And our research really cuts across the life course. So we, over the last couple of years, we've built together a big portfolio of research around homeless pregnancies and looking at the impact of homelessness during that period and the likelihood of a child being removed into state care, and the disproportionate level of child removals for our First Nations population, through to doing on-the-ground evaluation work with youth homeless service providers, housing providers, other health organisations, through to ageing services. So one of our most recent piece of work has been around the accessibility and appropriateness of aged care facilities, palliative care services, and also disability services for people experiencing homelessness. And at the moment, we're running a number of workshops and roundtables with the sector throughout this year to really drive some of those findings into actions and change, and getting a really broad representation of both people with lived experience the homeless services themselves, and the various other sectors kind of on board. So as I said, we've got lots of collaborations from various kind of different levels of services. And some of these are not just Perth-based. We are working across Australia and have really good partnerships with a number of key public hospitals that are the main hospitals accessed by someone experiencing homelessness, through to a vast range of homeless services, and whether these are drop-in or daycare or day centres, through to specialist homelessness services that provide primary or general practice care, and that could be on the street through to running clinics at transitional accommodation, or also operating kind of a standard GP type clinic for people once they're housed, so that people can continue to access healthcare along that continuum from maybe when they're street present through various transitional accommodation, but then still have the dignity and ability to access the same providers once they're housed, if they choose to. I won't go into specifics here, but part of what we, of course, do is the, meaty research stuff, and really look what this kind of slide shows is comparing a lot of what we found in a cohort of 2,000 people at one of the homeless services, rates of various mental health, physical health, and substance use disorders compared against the general Australian population. So you can see these dark blue columns are much higher than nearly all of the dark green ones, which represent what the Australian kind of rates are of various diseases. And I think what's kind of important kind of from this part of the research was that of these 2,000 odd people, 75% were multi-morbid. So they had 2 or more long-term chronic health conditions, with up to 38% having at least 1 physical, 1 mental health, and 1 substance use disorder as at trimorbidity. So really high rates of poor health. And then you add that on top of all these accessibility and other challenges. So you've got the most difficult healthcare to access for those who actually need it the most. And this kind of partnership we have with homeless healthcare in particular has led to a multitude of different research projects and ideas. And I suppose that comes back to my graph here, that it's really about these kind of co-developing the research projects from the ground and addressing the gaps from what the services see on the ground, so that the research will actually have an impact and it's not just going into a report on a shelf. So I won't talk through all 3 of these examples I've prepared today. I'll just go through the homeless deaths one really quickly, but it kind of shows a bit of a picture of how we kind of started. It's animated. So about 6 years ago now, myself and my supervisor, Lisa Wood, were in the UK for a conference, and we just happened to be there while they were putting on a vigil outside of 10 Downing House, their parliament over there. And it kind of brought to light some of what was happening on the street for us in Perth, where we were seeing a really large number of people experiencing or who had previously experienced homelessness dying really young. But there was no data being captured. There was no way to kind of record it. There was no one kind of tracking it, and there was certainly no advocacy around it. From this, we started getting notifications from the receptionist of the GP clinic that we were working with, and she would kind of notify us of every kind of death coming through. And this kind of started off with homeless healthcare, which we have like an ongoing research partnership with, all the ethics and contracts and everything in place for us to have this information, through to we've now got a list of over 10,000 people who have experienced homelessness at some point in Perth. And we are now tracking through still the notifications on the ground, but we now have access to government level data and deaths notifications. So it's really come from starting what we kind of observed in London through to, all right, what can we do in Perth? Let's start forging partnerships with local providers that are seeing this information. We put together a short kind of discussion piece in Parity, which is a homelessness magazine in Australia. So it was just a very conversational piece. This kind of led through to us doing quite a bit of media work. Eventually by 2022 or at end of 2021, there was an inquiry into deaths in Perth. We put a submission in, we kind of gathered all this information up really quite more robustly than initially, and put it together as a submission to our state level government. This led to a report coming out where the first recommendation that they posed was around that the government needed to actually track and collect some of this data. We eventually published it in the BMJ, and then this led to a whole another piece of work with The Guardian. This was a whole series of media articles working with a key journalist who then did a whole bunch of other advocacy work with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is one of our national level kind of data collection points. And again, a bit of advocacy to ministers around why the IJOHCONF25 should collect and report on some of this data. And now we're at a point where late last year, the Australian Institute actually released their first ever bit of data on homeless deaths, and they're about to do another piece on causes of death for people experiencing homelessness across Australia. And we are currently working with local coroners in Western Australia to access our coronial data and add this data into our piece. So this is just kind of one really quick example of how we've kind of taken maybe what we've observed in another country or an issue that's been observed on the ground where maybe the sector has been really frustrated or seeing a pattern, and kind of run with it with the kind of, I suppose, academic freedom where we are allowed to speak out, call out ministers, call out government, and be able to kind of say we need to do better. There are people dying. What can we do to make it better? And once we kind of get some of that cause of death data locally, we'll be able to start looking at more prevention work in that space. And I'm going to leave it there, but we've also done the same kind of thing for homeless pregnancies and for some of the climate work going on in Perth at the moment. So that's both in terms of kind of the cold and wet through to what's more of an issue is that more heat related and hot weather impact. And yeah, that's my email address and link to our website there. But really what we kind of pride ourselves on is that we're working with people on the ground. There's embedded lived experience throughout. We take a very kind of trauma informed approach, and you know, sometimes it can be a bit slow and it can be a bit messy and a bit frustrating, but it's actually pretty amazing to see what's happened over the last couple of years, and actually some of this big change in terms of how the country is actually going to be reporting and capturing some of this data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. That was an amazing presentation. I think you really reiterated the link between health and homelessness that many of the other panelists touched on. And I think that this home to health work is just an amazing example of the impact that coordinated efforts can make. if you would like to stay and submit a few questions for a quick Q&A segment, please do. Use the Q&A function on your bottom menu to submit any questions. I think we will have time to take a few. And then any questions we don't get to, we can continue the discussion in our LinkedIn group. I saw one question from our lovely partner, Todd Gunther. He asked about strategies to change the narratives around homelessness. So if anyone on the panel wants to speak to that, I think Shannen touched on that with their advocacy work. But if anybody on the panel wants to take a stab at that question. He said, what are practitioners doing to implement narrative change into their homelessness strategies?
Hi, Tiffany. I can just quickly respond to that. That's something that we've touched on. I think it's really listening to the research. I think over the years we've seen here in Canada that we continue to hold on to a narrative, who are the homeless individuals and what they need. But what we're seeing is very different. Who is homeless in Canada is very different from what the research is saying. And I think oftentimes that's where the lived experience comes in. That not all researchers are connected to what's happening on the ground, which makes our partnership with Khater so critical in that we are connected to the ground, so it bridges that gap, and there's that ongoing intentionality of ensuring that the data that we collect and the evidence that we collect, we're actually embedding it into the current policies, opposed to doing kind of like a hypothesis and kind of regurgitating data, because I think that's what we're seeing, a lot of regurgitated data as it relates to ending homelessness. And we really need to listen to who is homelessness, what they need, not necessarily what we think they need.
Thank you, Alana. I think you touched on such an important piece. We don't believe that people experiencing homelessness or who have experienced homelessness are voiceless. They have a voice and they can advocate for themselves. They just need the equitable partnership. Thank you. I don't see any.
I also responded to that on the chat box. Perhaps you could just read that if it's okay.
Yes, she and her colleagues have what they call the community of practice, which includes people with lived experience, officials, stakeholders, and they have ongoing conversations about their needs and their experiences. Thank you for that remembrance. And I don't see any other questions in the Q&A.
I think Isa wants to come in.
Yes. Sorry, Isa.
Hola. No, me gustaría hacer un comentario en torno a la pregunta anterior. Creo que es muy importante en términos de los cambios de narrativa, el incluirnos, como dicen, me voy a cambiar por el sol, perdón, como dicen nuestros amigos latinoamericanos de algunos, nada de nosotros sin nosotros. Creemos que la participación activa de las personas con experiencia de vida en calle es muy importante en estas instancias, que las políticas públicas no se hagan a puertas cerradas entre quienes trabajamos en la política pública, entre los académicos, sino con quienes viven la experiencia bien calle. Ahí vemos también que hay muchas diferencias en distintas organizaciones, por lo menos en nuestra casa tenemos nuestra experiencia, que la vida siempre ha sido participativa. No nos imaginamos, somos una organización co-construida, cofinanciada, copensada entre todos. Entonces creemos que es un paradigma que no hay otro modo de verlo. Entonces nos encantaría contagiarnos de ese espíritu para el resto, porque efectivamente no puede ser nada de nosotros sin nosotros. Eso quería aportar, muchas gracias.
You, Issa. Yes, nothing about us without us. We love that phrase. Thank you so much. And I think that we can conclude the webinar now. I don't see any other questions, but again, we are happy to make sure this discussion is ongoing in our LinkedIn group. So thank you so very much to all of our panelists, to our lovely interpreter, Carol, who helped us to ensure that our colleagues, Spanish-speaking colleagues, to participate fully today. We will share all of the resources from the panelists following the webinar, and as well as the recording. And again, if you're able to join our LinkedIn group so we can continue the discussion, that will be amazing. And have a good morning, afternoon, evening. Just